American government, federalism. If someone asked you to direct them to the Capitol, would you give them directions to the state Capitol building in your state, or would you tell them to buy a plane ticket and head toward Washington, D.C.? The United States is a federal system of government, meaning that its citizens are governed at multiple levels. That's what federal means. The national government is supreme, and it resides in Washington, D.C. The individual state governments operate out of the various state capitals in coordination with the national government, with local governments closest to the people operating in coordination with the individual states. Federal, state, 50, and literally thousands of local governments. Each of these levels has some degree of sovereignty. When they're operating within their own sphere of authority, they have the authority. That's an unusual arrangement. Most countries have what's called a unitary system of government. Under a unitary system of government, the national government alone has ultimate authority. Look at France, for example. There's 27 provinces. On paper, they look like the American states, but any decision that they make can be overridden by that federal national government. Not so in terms of the United States state governments. When they're acting within their legitimate realm of authority, they cannot be overridden by the federal government. They can sue the federal government, etc. So where are these actual dividing lines? What separates national power from state power? To answer this critical question, we need to go back to where it all started, to the writing of the United States Constitution itself in 1787. As you may or may not be aware, the Constitution of the United States is the nation's second governing document. The first was the Articles of Confederation adopted during the American Revolution. Those articles established a national government that was essentially a codification of a true friendship of states, a confederacy. Each state had one vote in Congress, and Congress had very few powers. It had no power to tax and no power to regulate economic activity or commerce. The states held those powers. This form of government was that of a confederacy. In it, sovereignty, where authority lied, power lied, was vested entirely in those sub-national governments, the states. The national government has no authority except what the states specifically grant to it together. In the Confederacy, at least 9 of the original 13 states needed to concur before any federal action could be taken. The government under the Articles of Confederation held together during the Revolutionary War, but after the war, the nation began to unravel. Rather than pulling together in this confederacy, the states tried to go their separate ways. Connecticut tried to upend the Massachusetts manufacturing sector by taxing its goods at a higher rate than the same goods coming from the nation's former enemy, England. North Carolina had no port deep enough to ship its goods, so it had to use the ports of Virginia and South Carolina. Both of those states placed a stiff tariff on North Carolina goods as a result. The bonds of friendship were weakened after the Revolutionary War. No power to tax, the national government under the Articles had to ask the states for money. They were slow to pay their required share of the states, if they paid at all. When a debtors' revolt called Shays' Rebellion broke out in western Massachusetts, that state's governor called upon the national government to send the army, which had no army to send. It was out of money. Congress itself rarely met. It had neither the money nor the authority, so why should its members waste their time traveling to the Capitol? A convention to improve the Articles was arranged out of dire necessity in 1787. And this convention quietly evolved into an effort to recreate the nation's structure of government totally anew. The U.S. Constitution was designed to accomplish what the Articles of Confederation had fallen short of: create a system of government strong enough to meet the growing nation's needs and keep this in balance. But the writers of the Constitution also had to take into account the existence and eminence of the states that had formed the country after the Revolution. Speaking for nearly all the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, Virginia's George Mason said that he would never agree to a union that failed to keep the states. And even if the delegates had thought differently, the Constitution had to legally be ratified by the states. It was a refresh of the Articles, and the states would not vote themselves out of existence. That was the reality, and it led the framers to invent a system of government the world had never seen before. It was a federal system, where sovereignty was divided between the national government and state and local governments. Each level would have final authority in its sphere of operation, and to make that work, each level would have to have the power to tax the people. Without that power, the power to raise money, raise revenue, it would not be able to maintain its independence from the other layers of government. For many Americans at the time, the issue was not whether the states should be kept. That was a given. The states were the mother of the nation. They had literally created it and given it life. The question was whether it was wise to create an independent national government capable of actions opposed by some or even many of the states. One such American was Patrick Henry, whose ringing cry, "Give me liberty or give me death," helped launch the revolution against Great Britain. When he read what the writers of the Constitution had written, he erupted in anger. He said, "Who authorized them to speak the language of we the people instead of we the states?" For Henry, it was the states that were sovereign, not the people. When the state conventions met independently to debate the Constitution's ratification, no issue was more hotly debated than whether the national government would eventually swallow up the state, even local governments entirely. The Constitution supporters announced that fear as groundless and noted that the powers of Congress were relatively few in number and predefined. Advocates of state power, like Henry, were nonetheless suspicious. They pointed to the clause that immediately followed the list of Congress's 17 listed powers. You can look this up. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. That clause seemed to them like an open-ended grant of national power. When the national government be tempted to craft excuses for why new laws were necessary and proper, resulting in ever-widening federal power, advocates for the states also objected to the Constitution's silence on the powers of the states. The Constitution listed only the federal government's powers. This concern led, in a few short years, to the ratification of the 10th Amendment alongside the Bill of Rights. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively and to the people. Amendment 10. The state powers are thus commonly referred to as the reserve powers. Reserve powers, state powers. At the time of its adoption, the 10th Amendment was thought to offer strong protection to the states. History reveals the 10th Amendment has generally fallen short of that purpose, however. The logic of the Constitution is such that the states have power over only those policies that are not within the federal government's control. Here's what the federal government can do, the states have everything else. The central question since the ratification of the 10th Amendment has been identifying the boundary of national power. Shrink that boundary, and state power expands. Expand that power of the federal government, and state power will shrink. Over the course of U.S. history, federal power has expanded more often than it has shrunk. The result has been a long-term shift of power toward the government in Washington, away from the individual state capitals, circumventing the 10th Amendment. I'll focus on three constitutional clauses that have been at the center of this drift away from the vision laid out by the nation's founders. One is the aforementioned necessary and proper clause, which empowers Congress to create whatever federal legislation it deems appropriate. Second is the Commerce Clause, which grants to Congress the power to regulate commerce or trade among the states. And the third is the Taxing and Spending Clause, which grants Congress the authority to tax and spend. The importance of the first of these clauses, the Necessary Proper Clause, was established early in the nation's history. In the very first years of George Washington's presidency, Congress authorized a national bank at the urging of Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton was determined to strengthen the nation's financial sector. Thomas Jefferson, who was Washington's Secretary of State, had a different vision for the nation's development. Jefferson claimed that the bank was unconstitutional given that Congress had not been granted the power to create it in the Constitution. Nevertheless, the bank was not challenged in the courts, and a few years after the charter of the First National Bank expired, Congress created the Second Bank of the United States. In the interim, state banks had become firmly established. Several states, including Maryland, levied a stiff tax on the branch of the national bank operating within their boundaries. The administrator of Maryland's bank, James McCulloch, refused to pay that tax, and the dispute went to the United States Supreme Court. In that court case, McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled strongly in favor of national authority. In the majority opinion, Marshall wrote that even though the Constitution did not expressly authorize Congress to create a national bank, it had been granted the powers to tax, regulate commerce, and print and borrow money. Invoking the Necessary and Proper Clause in his logic, Marshall said that the bank was a reasonable extension of those powers. The court went further, striking down Maryland's tax on the national bank, invoking the Constitution's Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Paragraph 2, Supremacy Clause, which confirms that federal law is the supreme law of the land. The court held that the federal government had the power to protect the bank from a state's effort to destroy it. The court's ruling in McCulloch versus Maryland established a vital precedent, a legal precedent, which the courts and the broader government would now follow. It established the principle of implied powers. Implied powers. The notion that Congress, rather than being confined narrowly to its listed powers in the Constitution, in fact possessed broad and substantial unlisted powers not listed in the Constitution, but reasonably inferred by the language within the document. More than a century would pass before Congress's commerce, taxing, and spending powers were proven to be so broad and substantial after this decision. The triggering event here was the 1930s Great Depression, which convinced many Americans that the U.S. economy was not a set of allied state economies, but a single national one, requiring new, sweeping national policies if it were to survive the downturn. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt assumed the presidency in 1933 after Hoover, one of his first New Deal programs was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC. You'll see this at a bank if you walk in. Thousands of banks had already shut their doors, having run out of money to pay their depositors who could no longer trust the banks, realizing they could lose their savings if the bank would fail during the Depression. There was a run on the banks. The FDIC now insured those deposits up to a certain deposit amount. If a bank failed, the federal government promised to reimburse the bank's depositors and serve as insurer of the bank's money. National economic policy was, almost overnight, now within the domain of the United States federal government. A bigger Depression-era problem was the growing number of unemployed working-age men unable to provide for themselves or their families. When the Depression hit, few sectors of the economy were spared. Roughly a fourth of the nation's workers went jobless, and another fourth could only find part-time work. Under America's federal system, states had responsibility for welfare assistance, but many states were broke. Income levels had fallen sharply, and so too had then state tax revenues. As food lines grew longer and people became more desperate, Americans looked to the federal government for help. Its tax revenues had also fallen, but unlike the states, it assumed unlimited power to print and borrow money. It could create cash, whereas the states could not, by printing treasuries and selling them to others. President Roosevelt's popularity after 1932 convinced Congress to enact more and more laws they believed would stimulate the local economies of their constituents, with mixed results. The U.S. Supreme Court, though, failed to find sure constitutional footing to allow FDR's more experimental economic programs and federal regulations. The court struck down many of his so-called New Deal initiative programs in the early years of the Depression by a 5-4 vote. There are 9 members of the Supreme Court, usually on the grounds that they exceeded Congress's authority to regulate interstate commerce. When Roosevelt won a massive re-election victory in 1936, it was clear that the American people were on the president's side and not on the court's. When Roosevelt threatened to pack the court and expand the number of justices on the court, adding more justices amenable to his federal actions, an epic showdown between the branches of government seemed unavoidable. Crisis was averted with the famed switch in time that saved 9. Owen Roberts, the youngest of the Supreme Court justices in the 5-4 majority, effectively switched sides on his interpretation of what constituted interstate commerce, tipping toward Roosevelt a 5-4 edge in Supreme Court cases going forward. Roosevelt backed away from this idea that he would add members to the Supreme Court to tip it in his favor. Soon thereafter, the court upheld the National Labor Relations Act, which gave employees the right to collectively bargain for shared wage and insurance demands. Roosevelt was able to launch a second New Deal in his effort to deal with the decade-long economic depression, setting a precedent for expansive executive power during times of American crisis. Subsequently, the court has afforded Congress's commerce power to be as broad as the economic needs of the nation. Today, as a result of that interpretation, Congress has authority to regulate nearly all aspects of commerce, everything from corporate mergers to private financial dealings, even to the extent of having the power to tell farmers how many acres of a particular crop they can plant in a given season. Though it received less attention at the time, the Supreme Court in the 1930s established another key precedent. In Butler versus the United States, the Supreme Court held that Congress's power to tax and spend is only limited by the requirement that it shall be exercised to provide for the general welfare of the United States. This is a very broad and consequential grant of power to our Congress from their interpretation of the Constitution to promote the general welfare. Allow me to share a real-life example to clarify what this interpretation of Congress's power allows and what it does not allow. If you're watching this lecture, there's a good chance you're under the age of 21. I'm going to assume that you've seen signage telling you that you must be 21 to enter taverns, buy beer, enter bars, or purchase alcohol in a store. You might be old enough to vote or join the military. Maybe you've already served, but you're not old enough to drink legally. Why do states have a minimum drinking age of 21? Just a few decades ago, most states had a younger age limit, generally 18. The change to 21 was a result not of the will of the people, but a result of the exercise of Congress's recognized spending power. Allow me to explain. In 1984, Republican President Ronald Reagan proposed a national minimum drinking age of 21, claiming that fatalities from alcohol-related traffic accidents involving young drivers was intolerably high, and that the federal government ought to do something about it. Congress liked the idea, but it lacked the constitutional authority to take direct action over the states, who had a clear domain to set their own drinking ages. States hold the constitutional power to determine legal drinking age, so how did Congress do it? It passed a law that would strip states of 10% of their federal highway funds if their drinking age remained under the age of 21, under the pretense of a connection between the rate of highway fatalities and the legal drinking age. The legislation had its intended effect. Rather than lose 10% of their highway funds, each of the 50 states reset the drinking age to 21 if it was not already 21. When the state of South Dakota challenged the law in the courts, the Supreme Court concluded that the federal law was a valid use of congressional spending authority because it provided for the, say it with me, general welfare. Congress's taxing and spending power was also the basis in the 1960s for President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. Johnson's social spending programs, modeled in part on FDR's own New Deal initiatives, thrust the federal government squarely into policy areas typically reserved for the states, including health care, public housing, welfare assistance, and education. Like Roosevelt, Johnson was a Democrat and wanted to leverage greater federal power for his party's aims. And like Roosevelt, Johnson was president at a time when Democrats controlled Congress and when more Americans were looking to the federal government for help. Many were asking for better schools, better health care, better welfare services, and their state was willing or even able to provide. Federal grants and aid to the states through newly printed federal dollars and debt became the prime instrument that allowed for Johnson to build out his Great Society programs. Federal grants in aid refer to federal cash payments to states and local governments, localities, for programs they administer. A common and very expensive example is the 1965 Medicaid program, which gives states federal dollars to provide health insurance to the citizens of their states with incomes below the poverty line. Importantly, states are not required to participate in Medicaid or any other federal grant program. They can refuse the money as their constitutional option. In fact, Arizona held out for nearly 20 years before joining the Medicaid program. On the other hand, if a state takes a federal grant, it is bound by the federal requirements that dictate its use. The money is appropriated by Congress, and Congress has the constitutional authority to stipulate how that money can be used. It's a gift, but it comes with strings. And it's a gift that people paid for already. A Medicaid grant, for example, must be used for health care for low-income residents. The money cannot be diverted to another purpose. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society initiatives led to a sharp rise in federal grants in the late 60s and 70s. Spending constituted a major shift in the relationship between the national government and the state governments, a change that came to be known as fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism. Greater federal control through the use of the purse. The term refers to the use of federal funds to extend the reach of the federal government into policy areas traditionally reserved for the states. A dramatic example would be the funds that Congress appropriated in 2020 in response to the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. Public health is largely a state and local government responsibility, and state governors and local mayors led the response to COVID-19. But their efforts were supported by federal funding, including an initial $25 billion to help state and local public health departments test for the disease. As the example suggests, federal grants do not constitute a federal takeover of state functions, but they do place a very heavy thumb on the scale, representing an effort to steer the policy focus and function of the state governments from the federal level. States still retain their authority and usually provide most of their own funding for these initiatives. 90% of public school funding, K through 12 in the United States, is provided by state and local governments, for instance, which also control nearly every education policy from the length of the school year to specific graduation requirements. The federal government has essentially no say in these policies. Nevertheless, federal grants account for 10% of school funding. And if a state accepts that share of the money, it limits many of the choices that state can make and steers state policy toward one favored by the national government. In the 1970s, public support for federal spending began to weaken as certain programs came under attack for renowned inefficiency and unintended consequences. Critics pointed out that, for example, some of those receiving federal welfare assistance were abusing the system, with many choosing a life of welfare checks and state dependency over a meaningful life of productivity. The federal dollars were actually enabling the intergenerational cycle of poverty instead of actually addressing it. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, he vowed to roll back the expansive spending programs created under prior administrations, including Nixon. Federalism, he argued, is rooted in the knowledge that our political liberties are best assured by limiting the size and scope of the national government. Reagan succeeded in persuading Congress to cut back on its use of coercive federal grants during his 8 years in office. Reagan also persuaded Congress to loosen the strings attached to some federal grants it retained. A federal government that maintained its financial support but abandoned the sharper edges of its coercive powers. Most federal grants are designated for a specific purpose, for example, improving energy efficiency in America's schools. Such grants are called categorical grants. Categorical grants. And they enable Congress a very precise level of control over state spending. Reagan convinced Congress to consolidate a number of these categorical grants into what are called block grants. Block grants, which are designated for a particular policy area but not for a specific purpose. A block grant for schools, for example, could be used for school construction, or it could be used for other school-related purposes, such as paying for textbooks, teacher salaries, or lab equipment, not just energy efficiency. Block grants give states and localities considerable control over how their federal aid is spent. They offer support in certain areas, but without the thumb on the scale that I mentioned. Another rollback in federal power came when Republicans took control of Congress after the 1994 midterm elections during the Bill Clinton administration, which happens to be my area of personal research. Congressional Republicans' chief target was the Aid for Families with Dependent Children program, which had been established during the 1930s Great Depression specifically to assist families whose breadwinner had deserted or died. The program provided direct cash assistance to eligible low-income families. There was no limit on how long a family could receive this direct cash assistance, and the amount increased if an unwed mother had another child. The program inadvertently incentivized women to go on welfare and to stay there. Furthermore, it disincentivized traditional family formation. The Republicans' alternative was the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, which enjoyed bipartisan support. It limited welfare assistance for most families to 5 years. In addition, able-bodied adults would have to seek a job or job training to remain eligible for the assistance while receiving the aid. That act, along with the economic boom of the late 1990s, dramatically shrank the number of families on welfare across the country. The welfare rolls were cut in half within just a few years. Efforts led by Republicans to roll back federal power largely ended with the passage of that act. In fact, after the terror attacks of September 11, 2001, it was Republican President George W. Bush who oversaw a marked increase in federal power, including the creation of a new federal agency, the TSA, or the Transportation Security Administration, which, rather than local police, puts federal agents in charge of security at all American airports. Bush also initiated the No Child Left Behind Act, which opened the door to more federal influence over local schools. Ironically, it was a Democrat, Bill Clinton, who oversaw the last real effort to reduce federal power in the United States in favor of state power. He was also the last president to serve during a year of budget surplus, a year in which the federal government actually spent less on federal programs than it took in federal tax revenue. Both major parties have supported or fought the use of federal power as it has suited their policy goals. The finer points of the Constitution have been less important to the parties than what they're trying to achieve when in power through their own policy initiatives. Legal arguments over the Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, over the past decade illustrate this dynamic well. The net result of the expansion of democracy through our history has been an unyielding nationalization of the federal system. Over time, power in America has shifted from the states to the seat of government in Washington, D.C. This trend is not irreversible, but it will likely take a significant shock or catalyst for Americans to recognize the imbalances that now exist within their system of government. Read the Constitution and you'll see for yourself.